Thank you for joining me today. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And the first thing I'll do is just sort of review what our objectives are for today. So obviously the first thing that I want to be able to do is define human trafficking. So we're going to go into that a little bit. And then we're going to discuss common methods and indicators of human trafficking so that all of you will be able to better identify those methods. And for those of you who are educators and trainers, this should give you a good baseline to be able to discuss this in trainings and to incorporate this into some of the work that you're doing. We'll also recognize how human trafficking and domestic violence intersect. And one of the things that I've included for everyone in the file section is a technical assistance bulletin that I just shared that reviews this information in a bit more detail. So you should be able to take some of that and also use that as a resource to incorporate in some of your trainings. And then finally, we're going to discuss some ways that you can incorporate human trafficking advocacy into the work that you're already doing. Now, obviously, all of the things that we talk about today are not exhaustive lists, but I've tried to refine a lot of this information down to some suggestions that I think are going to be helpful for everyone. But one of the things that I'm hoping will come from this webinar is a better connection between all of you and me, so that as you're working to incorporate human trafficking into your regular work, however you're doing that, whether it's through education, whether it's through direct service, you can always contact me and I will be happy to, to kind of talk you through whatever it is that you're trying to do in more detail. So let's start by defining what it is that we're talking about when we say human trafficking. So I use the definitions provided by both the Trafficking Victim Protection Act of 2000 and then also the Pennsylvania Act 105 from 2014. Both use the terms force, fraud, and coercion to define the methods used by traffickers that will press victims into lives of servitude. So when we talk about force, obviously that's any kind of physical restraint, physical harm, sexual assault, physical beatings, things like that. We then have fraud. Some examples of that might be false promises regarding things like employment or wages or working conditions. But we also see false promises of things like love, relationships, marriage, or a better life. And we're going to talk about that in a lot more detail as we move forward. But that fraudulent aspect of human trafficking is pretty consistent throughout all of the different scenarios and methods that we're going to talk about moving forward. And this is consistent once again in both labor and sex trafficking. And then we have coercion. Some examples of that may be threats of serious harm or physical restraints, psychological manipulation, document confiscation, shame or fear-inducing threats to share information or pictures with others, or to report them to authorities if they have any kind of status that's questionable or non-documented. We also find coercion pretty consistently with regard to using drugs and drug addiction as a method of manipulation. So drug-induced coercion, that's things like using a heroin addiction to make somebody engage in commercial sexual activity, their quote unquote payment being enough heroin to keep them from getting sick. And that's something that we see fairly consistently. Obviously, that coincides with the opioid epidemic that we're facing throughout the nation, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with throughout Pennsylvania. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on these definitions because I am not an attorney, but I think it's really important for all of us to just understand what the law says with regards to human trafficking. So we look at the law, and once again, this language is consistent in both the TVPA Act and our state Act 105, both of which, federal and state law regarding human trafficking. So sex trafficking is defined as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act. Now, some of you may be glazing over already because that's a lot of words. So we're going to talk about what those words mean in a minute. But you'll see here that after we have that list of stipulations we have in which the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion. So that's where those terms really come into effect. And those are the words that we come back to over and over again when we talk about what is human trafficking. Now, with regard to sex trafficking, you'll notice at the bottom it says, or in which the person induced to perform such act has not attained 18 years of age. So that's a pat way of saying, if anybody under the age of 18 is engaging in any kind of commercial sexual activity, you don't need to prove force, fraud, or coercion because they are already considered to be a victim of human trafficking and child sexual abuse. So that's really important to know. Also, one of the things that Act 105 was able to do is make sure that trafficking of a minor is a Megan's Law offense. So not only is that, not something, the force, fraud, or coercion doesn't need to be proven in court, but also if somebody is convicted of trafficking of a minor, they will also be added to Megan's Law, which was a significant win as far as prosecution goes. We then have the definition for labor trafficking, which is fundamentally the same: recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services, once again, through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. This time for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. Now we're going to go into that in a little more detail in a sec, but I just want to provide some context for these definitions. Now, before I do that, I'm going to say that once again, I am not an attorney. So this slide is sort of my way of explaining these definitions. So if there are any legal advocates or attorneys attending this webinar, I apologize because these are definitely not technical definitions. And there's a link for the Villanova Law Institute, the Commercial Sexual Exploitation Institute at the end of this webinar. If you want a more direct and succinct legal definition explanation, I recommend that you contact them and they can do a much better job than I did here. But for the purposes of just breaking down those definitions, I think it's important to just have a blanket idea of what we're talking about. So recruitment is the act of attracting a candidate for a job or activity. Harboring, to provide shelter to. Transportation, to move from one place to another. And I want to make sure that we all understand that transportation is one aspect of human trafficking. But for each of these definitions, we only need to have one if we're trying to prosecute human trafficking in court. So a lot of times we get confused between human trafficking and human smuggling. So human smuggling would be that transportation of one person from one place to another. Transportation can certainly be a part of human trafficking, but human trafficking does not need to include that transportation aspect in order for that to quote unquote count. Then we have provision, which has two sort of definitions. It can either be supplying something for a person, such as food or necessities. And we talked about that a little bit with regard to that coercion, right? Or fraud. So fraudulent provision saying, hey, if you come with me, I'll make sure that you get something to eat tonight. And then once they go with that person, it turns out that in order to get that food or to get that place to stay, they're going to need to perform a sex act or some form of labor without compensation. But it can also be arrangements or preparation. So the provision of a space or the provision of, a hotel room, something like that, in order to engage in, for example, a commercial sexual activity. Obtaining just means to acquire. Patronizing is to buy from or do business with, and soliciting is to make a petition for something desired. Now, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about these. Like I said, the CSE Institute does a way better job of that than I do. But I do think that this really helps to highlight some of the misunderstanding that we have when we talk about human trafficking. Because once again, a lot of times, especially with, what we see, I call it the SVU definition of human trafficking. We often see this very aggrandized sort of worst case scenario of somebody that's been smuggled and trafficked and chained to, a radiator in a basement and stuff like that. But the reality of human trafficking is a lot less exciting, but much, much more sinister because it goes unseen. And if you see all of these definitions, you can start to understand that human trafficking is a much more nuanced and much more detailed form of victimization than a lot of times we might think. One of the other things that I like to make sure we talk about is exploitation, because you can't have trafficking of humans without exploitation. And once again, this is something that we could spend a whole other 3 hours kind of digging into the details of, which I'm not going to do. But I think that for those of us that provide education, or for those of us that are trying to understand how we fit this issue of human trafficking into the work that we're already doing, understanding that exploitation is a factor and often the first step towards trafficking, it opens up our perspective of what human trafficking is. So what do I mean by exploitation? Well, when we look at exploitation of labor, we have things like treating workers unfairly for personal profit or benefit. So what that means in general is that most of the time, exploitation of labor is already commercial in nature because of the nature of labor in and of itself. We then have sexual exploitation, which is when vulnerabilities are used for the exchange of sex acts. So that scenario that I talked to you before about, where somebody may say, hey, I'll get you some food, but first you have to perform a sex act, that may not rise to the level of commercial sexual exploitation, but it can certainly lead to it. But it is a form of sexual exploitation. And so what we see very often is, people who are looking for victim services, who maybe are not at that level. If I backed up the slides, which I'm not going to, but if we looked at that technical definition of sex trafficking, there may not have been a commercial component yet, but they are still victims of sexual exploitation. And absolutely, they are individuals who are eligible for services and who are at high risk for trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. Just to kind of put a fine point on it, commercial sexual exploitation then is that sexual activity in exchange for something of value or the promise of something of value, either to the individual or to another person. So that makes the leap from just general sexual exploitation to treating a person as a commercial and a sexual object. So they become something that is a commodity, something that makes another person money. And that is where we often find survivors of sex trafficking. They're survivors of that commercial sexual exploitation. Now, there are 25 distinct forms of human trafficking as identified by the Polaris Project and the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Obviously, once again, this is not, these are not the only forms of human trafficking, but based on the research that they've been able to do and the people who have called into their hotline, they're starting to be able to make these different categories of human trafficking in places that we can find these different levels of trafficking and exploitation. I'm not going to read this list to you because you're staring at it while I'm talking. But what we are going to do in a little while is talk about what the most common of these distinct forms of human trafficking we tend to see in Pennsylvania. But I wanted you all to have a better idea of how big and nuanced this issue is, kind of before we move into the more detailed aspects of this. So hopefully everybody's had a chance to look through that and kind of get an idea. And obviously, as we'll see in a minute, There are some of these that are pretty exclusive to one category, but there's also a lot that sort of bridge the gap between both. So there's also sex and labor trafficking that is fairly common. We'll talk about that in a minute. I wanted to share some statistics because that's usually the first thing that people ask about with regard to human trafficking. So I will tell all of you what I typically say when I receive those requests, and it's very challenging. And any of you who are already doing human trafficking work in any way will know this to be true, because there aren't a lot of reliable statistics because of the fact that human trafficking is a crime. And so we, up until recently, had to rely on statistics about human trafficking cases that were able to be prosecuted in order to say that person is a victim of human trafficking because their trafficker was taken to court and charged with that crime. So as I'm sure you all can imagine, that number is pretty low, even nationwide. So when the Polaris Project and the National Human Trafficking Hotline really started to become prolific, we started to be able to base some of those statistics on people that were calling in for help and services. So even if they were not taking these cases to court, they were able to be identified as individuals experiencing human trafficking based on those guidelines that we've already reviewed. It's not a technical, human trafficking case, but these are individuals who are self-identifying as people in need of help. And the idea is that hopefully a human trafficking survivor that is connecting with the National Human Trafficking Hotline will then be connecting with services that will allow them to either take their case to court if that's what they choose to do, or to just engage in victim services so that they can, be able to move on from that experience and get the same kind of help and support that a domestic violence survivor, sexual assault survivor would be able to. So that's a very long-winded explanation of why statistics are not my favorite thing to talk about generally, but specifically with regard to this topic. But thankfully, Polaris Project has done the hard work of compiling statistics based on what they're finding. We also oftentimes base statistics on vulnerability. So we'll talk a little bit more about risk factors in a minute. And if you are doing local human trafficking awareness and you're being asked repeatedly for, well, what are the statistics? What does this look like in our area? Some of these areas of vulnerability are where we can look to say whether, our community is at risk for human trafficking. And the answer is always yes. So that's something that you can use. And also if you're looking for opportunities to apply for funding, that vulnerability factor is often a good way to help elevate why your community is in need of human trafficking services. So based on the Polaris Project, we can see here 10,615 individual survivors were identified in 2017, 8,759 cases were identified through the hotline, and there was a 13% increase in cases identified through the hotline. So we can see that as we promote this National Human Trafficking Hotline and also throughout the nation, we are promoting human trafficking awareness. More and more survivors are able to self-identify and are connecting with the hotline for help and services, which is not only important, it's really heartening to know that those efforts are now real. We're really seeing the benefit of, spreading the word about the hotline and things like that. You can see here also in 2017, just a breakdown of some of those cases that they are seeing, the forms of human trafficking. So 6,244 sex trafficking cases. We definitely see this as a trend that sex trafficking still remains the most prolific form of disclosed human trafficking. And all of us doing DV work understand that disclosure only represents a small margin of who are actually experiencing these things. 1,274 labor trafficking cases were identified, 851 were unspecified, and then 390 were a combination of sex and labor trafficking. So we talked about risk factors, and bear in mind that these risk factors are the combined risk factors of labor and sex trafficking. So we see a full 48%. The risk factor was recent migration or relocation. So whether it's somebody that's coming here from another country, and oftentimes we may find that people are coerced here, oftentimes with the promise of a better life in some way, shape, or form, whether it's through marriage, whether it's through, a job. They're coerced into coming to this country, and then their status is used as a way to manipulate them and coerce them into unpaid labor or commercial sex. But even general relocation, and one of the examples I often use, because we know that LGBTQ youth are at high risk and vulnerability for recruitment into trafficking. If home is not a safe place, if they are not able to stay at home, we see a lot of youth that are forced to relocate, and oftentimes will head to the nearest city where there may be LGBTQ support, or at least support for homeless youth. And that relocation automatically makes them vulnerable to recruitment. If they're in a new space, if they're in a new location, we know that traffickers are often keeping an eye out at bus stations, train stations, places that youth may go to find help, even libraries, and start saying, oh, you need a place to stay. I have this place. It's really great, so on and so forth. And then right after relocation, we have 15% risk factor of substance use. And so once again, we see that correlation between substance use and risk of recruitment for trafficking. Runaway homeless youth is right behind that. And then we have mental health concerns and being engaged in the child welfare system. So all of these things kind of intersect. And if we're thinking about risk factors for other forms of, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's sexual violence, family violence, these are all things that we are already seeing with clients that we work with, because the risk factors are often the same. Those high vulnerabilities make individuals, vulnerable for recruitment to trafficking in the same way that they may be vulnerable to an unhealthy relationship. Now that we've gotten through the statistics portion of the webinar, which is probably as much your favorite as it is mine, we're going to move into some of the methods of human trafficking. When we talk about recruitment, who's doing the recruiting? Well, this, I think, really highlights why it's so important for domestic violence advocates to engage in this work, because the number one recruitment method for sex trafficking is through an intimate partner. And then right behind that at 26% are family members. So we know that sex trafficking in particular is a form of intimate partner and family violence. Now, I use the term intimate partner in air quotes often when I do this training in person, because we know that traffickers often pose, we go back to that force, fraud, and coercion, that fraudulent relationship that they will cultivate with a person who they are trying to groom and recruit. So that trafficking survivor may identify their trafficker as their partner, as their boyfriend, as their husband, as a romantic interest. But what we know is that that trafficker doesn't see themselves that way. They see themselves as somebody who is maintaining control over a commodity. And they do that by creating that relationship. And we're going to go into that a lot more in a future section. But I think this is just really important for us to bear in mind that, when we are asked, well, why are domestic violence programs or domestic violence advocates now, focusing in on human trafficking? Well, the reason is because human trafficking is just another form oftentimes of this kind of violence and unhealthy relationship. With labor trafficking, as to be expected, the majority of recruitment comes through job offers, which isn't shocking. And then we also have a family factor here at about 10%, because we know that sometimes, especially if there is organized crime that sort of flows from one country into this one, a family member may either by choice or by coercion, traffic somebody to say, hey, you have to go work in the, in the nail salon in America, or they're gonna, continue to extort money from me, or whatever else it is that might be going on in that country of origin. So we do see a family factor in labor trafficking as well. When we look at those common methods, so you may remember that lengthy 25 forms of human trafficking that have been identified, we see escort services, residential, and outdoor solicitation as the most prevalent methods of sex trafficking here in Pennsylvania. I want to break down what the differences are between these, because they, at first glance, they may kind of seem like they're all the same thing. But when we look at escort services, that's a commercial sex act that occurs at a temporary indoor location. So the majority of sex trafficking that you may work with, the individuals who have been trafficked may say, they would get a hotel room for a night or for a weekend, and then they would take quote unquote dates at that location, or they may have several locations that they are using as a temporary spot in which to meet people that they invite to that location. Or occasionally it may be a sex buyer that provides the location and requests that that individual come to that predetermined location. But one way or another, that location is temporary, and that service is requested usually through a third party. Residential sex trafficking, this is where a residential brothel is run by a network of traffickers. So we see this a lot with organized crime, where there may be a residence that they get the word out that this location is where you can go. So this tends to be a bit more insular, but this is absolutely something that we see very frequently within organized crime, gang-related activity, where there's a house that maybe several people are living in at one time and providing commercial sex, either for other, members of that organized crime organization, or through invitation by somebody in that network of traffickers. So this isn't something that you would typically see, through, online dating services and things like that, which typically is where escort services will advertise. A lot of times we kind of think about an escort service, well, where do you even, where does somebody even know to look for a commercial sex engagement? A lot of times they're using those online dating resources. So Plenty of Fish, I can't remember any of the names of them anymore, but it's not this like seedy underbelly. It's a very open and obvious place where other people are trying to meet and date and stuff like that. We even know that sometimes people are using now Instagram, Snapchat, and other technology and web-based social media to engage in escort services as well. So that residential is then something that, is a location that remains consistent and the same, and advertisement tends to be word of mouth. And then finally, we have outdoor solicitation. And when we think about human trafficking, sex trafficking, this is typically what most people tend to imagine. This is trafficked individuals are forced to find buyers in public outdoor locations. So this is where, we have that kind of old, idea of somebody that's hanging out in a, certain part of town, or on a street corner, or a truck stop, or things like that. We definitely find nowadays, because it's not the 70s anymore, we see that the majority of trafficking that used to take place in those, those parts of town, that everybody kind of knows about, but nobody goes to, while you can still absolutely see that, more and more, those types of situations are moving to the online escort advertising, and outdoor solicitation tends to occur much more frequently in truck stops. And so, here in Pennsylvania, we have a lot of those. So that outdoor solicitation tends to really focus in on those truck stop locations, things like that. Now, once again, this is not an exhaustive list, and this doesn't mean that all of those other forms of trafficking are not also occurring here in Pennsylvania, but these are the ones that I selected, that I feel are representational of a lot of what we are seeing, and a lot of you who are doing this work already are probably most familiar with. So then we have the most common methods of labor trafficking, and we see domestic work, agriculture, and peddling or begging. Now, domestic work, that's domestic home care workers who live with employers and provide services. So we see this oftentimes with regard to, once again, people who are recruited from a country of origin to work for, a diplomat or somebody that's here in the United States. They may be recruited and told, you're going to come and live with me and take care of the kids, and we'll take care of all of your paperwork. But they may never do that. So that once that person is in the home, it's not safe for them to leave, which makes it very easy for the trafficker to exploit them for their labor. Well, you have to take care of my kids and cook all my meals. And if you step foot out of the house, they're going to arrest you and, deport you, basically. And then there's also situations where somebody is brought here legally, but once they are in the home, their paperwork is confiscated. So anything that they have that says they're here legally is taken from them, kept in a safe, and they're told, well, when you pay me back for bringing you here and getting all this paperwork, then I'll give that to you. And just so you know, if you're working with somebody that discloses that to you, under Act 105 in Pennsylvania, that is a felony offense. So confiscation of somebody's identification, passport, work visa, anything that is theirs and that provides their identification and ability to be here, that is now a felony offense. And we have agriculture, which is very prolific in Pennsylvania. We have a lot of farm culture throughout the state. So this is exploitation of labor in agriculture and animal husbandry fields. And so we see very often in these cases, trafficking is very difficult to nail down as far as who the actual trafficker is because of supply chain. Somebody may be recruited to work here, and they may come here with a work visa that may be sponsored by someone else. And then once they get to the actual farm, they're told something different. So what this might look like is somebody who agrees to work on at an orchard for the season because they're told that they'll be paid per piece. But then once they get here, they're told, no, you're paid by pound. And so those things are really different with regard to how much money you can make. So, but who's the person to blame? Is it the person who recruited them initially? Is it the person who they're working for now? Is it that middleman who negotiated bringing them in? So the agricultural aspect of labor trafficking can be a little difficult. And we have some resources at the end of this webinar that if you're working with somebody who is a survivor of labor trafficking, there are some legal services that help figure that out and help get them connected to legal representation. Because it's not always trafficking, but it is often exploitation. So there's unfair labor law that may be applicable in these cases. And then the last one here is peddling or begging. This is forced solicitation of donations or sale of goods for fundraising. Now, when I first saw this, I thought that this was like, if you've ever driven through a city and you have somebody that's asking for donations, they're standing around, or they might, wipe your window for you and then ask for payment. That's not actually what we're talking about here. I mean, it can be, but one of the examples that I was given, if you've ever had somebody show up on your front porch, usually a younger person, that will say they're selling magazine subscriptions. And they're trying to sell magazine subscriptions. They're coming into the neighborhood, blah, 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 blah. And you think, oh, this is great. I'm helping out this kid. I'm going to get these magazines. Well, a lot of times those are kids who are recruited from parts of the state where, they may have a lot of income inequity. So they're saying, oh, you want to make a couple extra bucks? Come and get in this van. We're going to drive out to the suburbs. We're going to sell magazine subscriptions, and you're going to be able to take home X amount of dollars. So the kids go and then, they spend the whole day selling these magazine subscriptions. And then when they come back, they're told, oh, well, you had a quota and you didn't meet that quota. And I bought you McDonald's, so I have to take that out. So actually, you're not going to get paid for anything that you did today. So that's a pretty common form of labor trafficking that we don't often think about. Now, I don't want everybody to freak out next time somebody comes to the office and says, my kid's selling popcorn for a school fundraiser. Like, that's still okay. But I do think it's really important for us to understand that sometimes, those things are presented to us just so we won't think that they're labor trafficking. So these people will recruit young people, or they'll say that they're affiliated with a church and they're going door to door to take donations. And so it's always really good to just ask some questions, to start understanding a little bit more about the situation. And obviously, when we're talking about this with community partners, we are not encouraging them to rescue, quote unquote. I don't use that term myself, and I hope none of you do either, but we're not saying next time a kid shows up at your front door, invite them in and, save them from their situation. Absolutely not. We're not doing that. We're just being mindful of the fact that sometimes that can be labor trafficking, and we may call the National Trafficking Hotline and say, hey, a kid just showed up, they had this name badge on, they're affiliated with this company, and I just wanted to let you know in case you can follow up and find out if this is legitimate or not. Those are some common methods of labor trafficking that we see in particular here in Pennsylvania. And then finally, we talked before about the fact that there's, a growing, sex and labor trafficking connection. So a lot of us are used to, at this point, seeing, the big trafficking cases that tend to be reported about throughout the Commonwealth are, massage parlors and nail salons that get busted for being human trafficking rings. So these are storefronts that pose as massage, health, beauty businesses that conceal sex and or labor trafficking. So in some cases, those nail salons are labor trafficking, right? Those individuals are recruited, they're working all day, every day, they're not given breaks, they're not being paid, and that's straight labor trafficking. But in some cases, they are also being forced to give erotic massage, they're forced to engage in sex acts. So in addition to the labor of, working in the nail salon, they're also performing commercial sex through force, fraud, or coercion. We also see this in bars, strip clubs, and cantinas. So when we think about sex trafficking, most frequently, we think about people who are forced into prostitution. But what we often don't think about are individuals who are exploited to work in strip clubs, who are working in bars or cantinas. So you may see up in the front of the house, hostesses and individuals who are either exploited to pretend like they're going to offer sex to people who spend X amount of dollars, or in many cases, they are coerced to actually perform sex acts on people who spend X amount of dollars. But then in the back, you have kitchen staff who are also being exploited for labor. So you see these places who are really engaging in both forms of sex and labor trafficking. And that hostess who is waiting tables is also not being paid for that, in addition to the sex acts that she is being coerced into providing. And then finally, we have illicit activities. So that's really any other criminal activity that uses elements of force, fraud, and coercion to recruit. And this is a little sticky, but this is situations in which somebody may be, through force, fraud, or coercion, coerced into selling drugs, because they owe money or they're looking for a place to stay. This isn't sex trafficking. We can't really, it's labor trafficking, but if you're selling drugs, that's illegal, right? So it's not like you can go to the cops and say, hey, my buddy's exploiting me to go sell marijuana on the street corner, right? Because you're going to get arrested. It's important to understand, though, that within these illicit activities, there is often a correlation to sex trafficking. So one of the things that I often say, if we're talking about sex trafficking, you don't find commercial sex without also drug trafficking, gun trafficking, et cetera, because one feeds the other. So if you have a booming drug trafficking enterprise, at some point, you're going to run out of drugs and you're going to have to obtain more of them. The best way to do that is to sell a person who you can sell over and over and over and over and over again. And when that person is no longer able to perform that service, you can find many others that you can groom and recruit to do the same thing. So often we see criminal organizations that are using sex trafficking as a way to fund all of their other illicit activities. But for a lot of reasons that I'm not going to get into in this training, law enforcement tends to focus, a lot of time and energy on drug trafficking. And I'm not trying to disparage law enforcement. There's a lot of reasons for that, right? Drug trafficking is a lot easier to investigate, to prove. It takes a lot less time. So they may be able to, to dig into a drug trafficking situation, but the sex trafficking oftentimes flies under the radar for a lot of reasons. So criminal activity and criminal enterprise really relies on sex trafficking as a way to fund a lot of other things. The take-home point, and what I'm building up to here, is when we talk about force, fraud, and coercion, what do we see as the most common reported methods of this? We see isolation, we see emotional abuse, we see economic abuse, threats, and physical abuse. What does this look like to everyone, right? When we do our DV 101 trainings, aren't these the same things that we use to describe what is domestic violence, right? There's a huge intersection between the methods that traffickers use and the methods that domestic violence perpetrators use to control the individuals that they are in relationships with. So we're going to talk about that next. So when we talk about power and control, obviously, we already kind of talked about this, but the vast majority of sex traffickers pretend to have romantic interest in the individuals that they recruit. So we already kind of went over that. But there's an intersection here between family and domestic violence and human trafficking. And these are some examples. So a mom may sell their daughter to make money for drugs. That is familial trafficking, right? And perhaps this is because mom was recruited when she was young and she's been engaged in trafficking in one way or another. And now she has a daughter, mom's addicted to drugs. She's not able to engage in that, or she's not attracting individuals to pay for sex in the way that she used to, but now she has a daughter, and the daughter is now being recruited and turned out to make money for drugs. And that's terrible to think about, but often quite common. In another situation, we may see a boyfriend who threatens to out his partner if he doesn't engage in commercial sex. So, basically, hey, I'm going to tell everybody that you're gay unless you make this commercial sex tape with me that I'm going to sell, or unless you engage in commercial sexual activity so that we can make money. In another situation, we may see an older brother who forces their younger brother to recruit girls from his class. So now this younger brother is complicit, but there may be a consequence if he doesn't do what the older brother says. So, that's an intersection that we see quite frequently of that power and control dynamic. And then we have an example here of a husband who convinces his wife to strip for extra money. And this, oftentimes flies under our radar, for the same reasons that sexual assault within marital relationships oftentimes flies under the radar. But this is absolutely an indicator of human trafficking, right? A husband who exerts power and control to say, hey, you have to go down for amateur night and make some extra money. And if you don't, there's going to be some kind of consequence. So we see here all of these examples where power and control really looks identical to the power and control that we're already familiar with the domestic violence survivors that we work with. And when I do this training in person, this is often where we start to come to that aha moment where we say, oh, I think I've probably been working with human trafficking survivors for my entire career as an advocate. Because some of these things now start to come full circle and you say, oh, I remember a situation where somebody said this was an abuse tactic that their husband or partner was engaging in. When we talk about that power and control, we talk about trauma bonding, and this is something that we see consistently in both domestic violence relationships and human trafficking situations. And those trauma bonds really rely on a handful of things. They're, a form of emotional abuse, and it relies on the constant threat of and follow through on consequences, right? So you're going to say, you need to do what I tell you, or there's going to be a consequence, whether that's implicit or explicit, whether there's been a physical assault, if somebody doesn't follow through with something, or that threat of physical assault is enough to convince them to do whatever that person asks. And with trauma bonding, the bridge here is affection. This is where that means of control really, really becomes consistent, because there's situations where you can gaslight someone. There's situations where you can threaten to beat them up if they don't do what you say. But in trauma bonding, there's also affection. There's a bond that's created that makes that person feel like, okay, I want to have the good stuff. I want to have that affection. I want this person to love me. I want this person to pay attention to me. And sometimes the real threat is simply the removal of that affection or the removal of that attention. And so once again, this is clearly something that we already are familiar with in a domestic violence situation. But with human trafficking, we see this trauma bond become a consistent and absolutely sometimes unbreakable barrier for that survivor to really leave the situation and start to heal. And so what we see here oftentimes is, like I said, violence or threats of violence, but often it's that alternating between violence and kindness. That kind of, well, I wouldn't have hit you except for that you didn't do what I said. I don't want to do this. I don't want to hurt you this way. I don't want to be doing this. You made me do it. So that's something to consider. And then we also have this belief, this consistent belief that the exploiter will know and will retaliate if there is even a disloyal thought that goes through that survivor's mind. And this may sound silly, but I think for most of us, when we've been working with a domestic violence survivor, there's that moment where they say, I don't even want to talk about this because he's going to know. He's going to know that I talked to you. She's going to know that I'm sitting here asking for help, and she's going to hurt me, or she's going to hurt my little brother. And so we need to really remember that even though sometimes to us that seems silly, in these situations of trauma bonding, and often because people are recruited so young, I've had survivors that I've worked with that thought their trafficker was a mind reader. And it's because traffickers are master manipulators, and they understand how their victim's mind works. And they're able to make it seem as though, they know what they're thinking. There's also the isolation factor. It's very easy to manipulate someone when they are isolated, and I'm talking to DV advocates, so I really don't need to go into a lot of detail about that. And then they utilize the shame and stigma that's associated with prostitution and rape. And so if this is an individual who's been raped repeatedly, that's engaged in commercial sexual activity, maybe they realize that the situation is exploitative, maybe they want help, and the trafficker will say, well, who's going to help you? You're just a hooker. Nobody's going to listen to you. Nobody's going to want to help you. And after everything that's happened to you, you're worthless. And they're going to reinforce that idea in that survivor until they feel like, you know what, the only place that I feel safe and the only place that is quote unquote normal to me is in this trafficking situation. And so, as I'm sure you can imagine, that trauma bond becomes the biggest barrier for a survivor to overcome. And this is one of the biggest misconceptions about human trafficking, is that once you get that person out of the trafficking situation, they're going to be grateful, they're going to feel quote unquote rescued, and they're going to immediately begin the process of healing. And the reality of the situation could not be further from the truth. The reality is that once they are away from the trafficker, a lot of times they feel scared, They may miss them. It's the same kind of dynamics that we see in DV relationships. And what do we say over and over? It takes 9 times, 10 times, 6 times on average. The numbers change, but it takes a lot of times for somebody to successfully leave an abusive relationship. And it's no different for a survivor of trafficking. So that's important for us to remember. So to kind of cap off that section, the impact for survivors of human trafficking is the same as the impact on survivors of domestic violence in many ways. Oftentimes, a survivor of human trafficking will return to either their trafficker or a similar situation. And what do we know about trauma, right? We return to what feels comfortable. And if what's comfortable is dysfunctional, then that's going to be where we continue to go until we're able to heal. And that takes a long time. They often self-blame for their victimization. Well, it's kind of my fault because he told me not to wear, a certain outfit and I did it anyway. So it's my fault, or it's my fault I didn't meet quota. He told me I was going to get a beating and I didn't meet quota. So it's actually my fault that this is happening and not his. Oftentimes, survivors have sympathy or feelings of responsibility for their trafficker, in the same way that we know domestic violence survivors often feel responsible for the feelings of their abusive partner. That's why, that suicide threat is often so convincing. Well, it's going to be my fault if they decide to go through with suicide. So that feeling of responsibility or sympathy is consistent with trafficking survivors as well. They feel disempowered and they lack resources and support. And so you can imagine that for an individual that's experienced the other traumas that are associated with exploitation, either of labor or sexual exploitation, on top of, just feeling disempowered in general, they then, feel like, well, even if there's resources out there, they're not for me. And that's one of the things that we run into when domestic violence programs begin to start this work of human trafficking is how can we make sure that survivors of human trafficking know and understand that these services are for them, that they belong here, and that we will find ways to connect them with the resources and support that fit them best. So what does that look like? The first thing I always like to discuss is what do survivors need? And so, this is going to look different for every individual, but by and large, we need to consider that a survivor of human trafficking, just like a survivor of domestic violence, may need emergency medical attention. So we know that very consistently, survivors of human trafficking do not have reliable access to medical attention. So even if they haven't experienced a physical assault, they may need a checkup. They may be at risk for STI. They may have previous assault that was never treated. So they have high risk of traumatic brain injury. They have high risk of relatively innocuous health issues that may be out of control because they were never treated properly. Things like, once again, STI, if they've had abortions that there was no aftercare for, if they have forms of cancer or long-term medical issues that have never been treated, medical attention is one of the first things that they may need just so they know what's going on. In some cases, they may need detox and rehabilitation. So that's something that if you're going to be engaging in direct service, and once again, this is something that our domestic violence survivors oftentimes also need. But if a trafficking survivor has just been recovered, it's important to have a good, warm referral relationship with the local detox and rehabilitation program so that you are able to get them connected to that service immediately. Because oftentimes, if that's what they need first, if you can make a warm referral, they can engage in that in the moment when they're ready, and then they can come to you for services once their rehabilitation is complete. They also need shelter or housing with staff who are well-trained in complex trauma. And one of the things that I like to point out here is that I know that one of the biggest challenges with regard to shelter and human trafficking survivors is that sometimes there's a lot of issue with bringing human trafficking survivor into shelter for lots of different reasons. So really being prepared to offer safe permanent housing options to trafficking survivors is one of the best ways to help them gain their independence. Also, we track that right along with ongoing case management from verified human trafficking, domestic violence, or sexual assault program. And I say this because no matter where a trafficking survivor goes, whether they're able to engage in safe and permanent housing, whether they're going to a different shelter, we still need to be providing mobile advocacy. We still need to be making a plan that we're going to be meeting with them regularly, that we're going to help them connect with other supports in the community, because we need to be able to offer the same level of case management and care that that survivor would receive should they be in shelter. And they may need that service for a lot longer than we're typically used to offering it. But part of helping them regain independence is preventing them from needing to rely on unhealthy resources to feel comfortable. And sometimes it can take a really long time for them to start to really regain their independence fully. And so being able to help them through that is crucial to human trafficking advocacy. And then obviously we have trauma-informed counseling services. And so helping survivors connect with counseling and engage in counseling to start working through that trauma is incredibly important and a huge aspect of human trafficking advocacy. I often tell people human trafficking advocacy is identical to domestic violence advocacy, but it is a long game. We're not doing short-term 30-day stuff here. Typically, this is long-term case management, long-term housing assistance, so on and so forth. Whatever we decide to do, and we may not decide to do direct service right away. We may not just decide, whatever it is that you feel prepared and ready to engage with. I like to always ask these questions with regard to a human trafficking survivor. The first thing that we need to ask is which needs are being met by that trafficker. And this is hard sometimes, but when we break it down, that trafficker is providing them with everything: love, a place to stay, a feeling of belongingness, a feeling of, even if that system is dysfunctional, the individual is still a part of it. They may be providing food, they may be providing, whatever those basic human needs are. So what we have to ask ourselves as advocates are what needs are not being met by that trafficker or exploiter. And then we need to look at how we can collaborate with other agencies, with other organizations within our community, with other providers, to offer services that will help them get those needs met and avoid returning to the trafficker or the exploiter. So that trafficker may be providing love, but is it really love? No. It's what they are presenting as love fraudulently. So we may not be able to provide love for them, but we can start to help them feel that sense of belongingness someplace else. We can get them connected with resources that a trafficker may mindfully prevent them from accessing, like medical care, rehabilitation, anything that may empower that individual to start taking better care of themselves and not relying on the trafficker for every need. But we can't do that alone. And that's why collaboration is so critical with regard to human trafficking advocacy. So some things that we can do to assist: first and foremost, don't expect a survivor to recognize that their situation is exploitative or to present themselves as being in need of immediate intervention or quote unquote rescuing. And once again, I do not use the term rescue. We're not rescuing people. That is something that I stand on my soapbox about. And any of you who have met me before will thank me for not going into the rant that I was about to go on to. Needless to say, we are advocates. We meet people where they are on their terms and try our best to meet the needs that they present so that they can begin the long process of healing. But we're not rescuing people, and we're not expecting them to automatically identify as a human trafficking survivor. In some cases, they may know that human trafficking is a thing and think that it's something completely different from what they're experiencing, and that is okay. The important thing is that we know that they are somebody that, needs our help and services and that we're willing to provide it. We won't use strategies that switch between treating an individual as an offender and a survivor in need of help. And so what that means is that we're not going to be kind of code switching, and in one case, when we're working with law enforcement, treating them like they're potentially a criminal because they've engaged in prostitution. But then when the officer is out of the room, we'll say, hey, now let's talk about, what services we can provide, if it turns out that you're actually a human trafficking survivor. Now, I know nobody on this webinar would ever do anything like that, but that is just an example that's really important, because oftentimes when we are, starting to do human trafficking work, and especially in juvenile situations, there can be situations where, somebody may be treated as a potential offender, or in certain situations, if a juvenile, for example, is coming into a CAC to give a forensic interview, the CAC will never do an interview for a child that's in shackles if they're being brought from a development center, for example, because that child should be treated with the respect they deserve as a survivor of trafficking, not as somebody who may potentially run. So hopefully that makes sense. We're instead going to recognize the various symptoms that trauma, exhibits, coping mechanisms that people use, and have helped them survive while being trafficked. So we're not making a judgment call about whether or not somebody is quote unquote guilty or not guilty. We're not making a judgment call about whether or not they're a quote unquote real trafficking victim or not. We are simply meeting them where they are, recognizing that they're a person who has experienced trauma, and working to help them in whatever way we can do so. This is a no-brainer for everybody that's an advocate, but I keep it in here anyway because it's important. We don't react verbally or physically in any way that communicates disgust or disdain, right? We never do that. So continue not doing that. We're not judgmental. We listen with empathy. That's our jam as advocates, and we will continue to do that with human trafficking survivors. And we don't dispute facts or comment on motivation. This is going to stop the flow of information, and it's going to damage rapport. So we've all worked with trauma survivors, and we know that when somebody's experienced trauma, they recall and retell that trauma all number of different ways. We're not questioning that. We're not saying, well, last time we met, you said it happened this way. We're just helping that survivor share their story, and we're making them feel as comfortable and safe as possible while they do that. And then finally, don't assume sole responsibility for meeting all the needs of trafficking survivors. We don't do this for our domestic violence survivors. Why on earth would we do it for trafficking survivors? We create a systematic response in the same way that we do for anything else, and we create interagency relationships in order to meet that survivor's needs comprehensively. So what does that look like? It can look like leading or participating in a local or regional human trafficking task force. It can also be incorporating human trafficking into existing task forces or work groups. So if some of you are already hosting domestic violence task forces or work groups, there's ways that you can incorporate human trafficking into that existing agenda, because honestly, the people that you're already collaborating with for assistance with domestic violence are going to be the same ones that you're going to be reaching out to for assistance with human trafficking. So this is something that you can very easily incorporate into what you're already doing in a lot of ways. But if you aren't engaging in that way, or you don't have a local task force, there's regional human trafficking task forces that are all throughout the Commonwealth. And if you have questions about that, I'm starting to get a good list of resources together. So if you're looking for a way to engage with a more regional human trafficking task force, shoot me an email, or you can let us know in the chat box here, and I can do a little looking around and see what the closest ones to you might be. You can also, another thing to do is add examples of human trafficking scenarios to your existing trainings and presentations. So I gave some good examples of ways that human trafficking can co-occur with domestic violence. And so just incorporating some of those small examples into your existing trainings will help community members understand that this is a form of interpersonal violence as well. One of the other suggestions I think is really helpful is starting to create internal policies that help outline best practices for human trafficking survivors. So if you're going to be doing this work, talk about it. Talk about it in your agency first. Talk about what it's going to look like. Talk about if there's, different things that you need to think about or do if you're going to be bringing human trafficking survivors into shelter, for example, or providing mobile advocacy or housing. Once again, the answer typically is do the same thing that you would do for any domestic violence survivor, but there are situations that are more nuanced. And it's really good to troubleshoot those ahead of time so you can start to think about, okay, what are we going to do in this situation? And this is one of those things that you can absolutely contact me. And I'm not saying that I've got all the answers by any stretch of the imagination, but I am happy to talk through that with you and just kind of, troubleshoot it and start to come up with some ideas that might work. Or at the very least, commiserate with you and say, hey, I wish we really had a better answer for this, but let's keep talking about it. And then the other thing that you can do, and one of the most simple things to do, is to create or renew relationships with any local agencies and service providers that you think might be valuable for warm referral or otherwise. So things like cross-training. If you're going to be working with a local rehabilitation center, talk to them about doing some cross-training. Hey, I'll come and do a lunch and learn on human trafficking and domestic violence. If you can come to our lunch and learn, talk about rehabilitation services and how we can work together. You can also work together on response protocol development. And this is one of the first and most fundamental things that can really benefit your community, is to get everyone together and say, what do we do? How are we going to work together if we have a situation where a human trafficking survivor is either recovered through a law enforcement operation, Homeland Security recommends that they come to our shelter or our area, or somebody self-identifies and we need to get them connected to community resources. So that response protocol development is a key factor in human trafficking advocacy and something that you can start doing right now. And then we also have, resource sharing. So very simply, just, in this kind of crosses over into cross-training, but if you can't find the time to do cross-training, you can at least drop resources off places and collect resources to share. And then finally, warm referral. So all of this kind of tracks into, if I'm going to be sharing a resource with somebody, I should also be able to give them a good recommendation about who they can talk to. So I use rehabilitation as an example a lot, but if you're going to be referring somebody to a rehabilitation program, it's great to be able to provide a resource and then say, hey, I know Sally so-and-so from the local Drug and Alcohol Commission, and I'm going to introduce you to her so we can start working on a plan, instead of just giving them that brochure or resource and saying, here you go, why don't you give them a call? These are some things that you can do right now to really start engaging in human trafficking advocacy that isn't like the full bore, I'm opening my own human trafficking shelter and I'm going to do that. If you want to do that, awesome. But if you are not ready to do that, these are some starting points. Now I have a question here. If anybody has a best practice policy regarding human trafficking that they're willing to share. So I'm going to put that out there to everyone. And if anyone is doing this work and has an internal policy that they're using, if you feel comfortable sharing that with me, I can then share that with the individual who's asking. Or if the person who's asking would like me to just share their information, I can do that too. So finally, before we get into Q&A, we only have a little bit of time left. I just wanted to put this up here for everyone. These are some labor trafficking resources in Pennsylvania. We have the Pennsylvania Immigration Resource Center, which provides support for legal issues regarding immigration status, human trafficking, and also other forms of abuse. I know pretty much everybody here is familiar with PIRC and loves them as much as I do. There's also Justice at Work, which used to be called Friends of Farm Workers. They support low-wage workers through the provision of legal services, community education, and advocacy. So they're a really good resource for those cases that I talked about before that either are absolutely labor trafficking or maybe more along the exploitation of labor. So they're an excellent resource as well. And then, of course, We have the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline. When I was doing direct service, I actually was able to connect with the Resource Center hotline as a way to find out-of-state resources for somebody who was from a different country, and there were resources specific to that country in the place that they were able to connect me with. So they're actually a really good resource, even beyond, emergency hotline situations. And then, you've heard me refer to the Polaris Project throughout this presentation. If you haven't been to their website yet, please, they have so much information on human trafficking, and really a lot of courses, a lot of, written materials, statistics, reports, things like that. And then there's also the Health Education Advocacy and Linkage, known as HEAL Trafficking Network. They are amazing, especially if there's anyone here that's doing work within medical and hospital systems or public health. HEAL Trafficking is a public health oriented network, and they have a toolkit specifically to assist public health and healthcare in developing human trafficking screening, policy development, all of that stuff. And they also have a couple of amazing listservs that you can hop on and get, connected to people nationwide who are doing human trafficking education. I can't say enough great things about them. So I encourage you to join that network, download the toolkit, and incorporate a lot of that information. And then obviously PCAR, Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape, they are also doing amazing human trafficking education and work. So please reach out to them and find out, even for those of you in standalone domestic violence programs, if you're going to be engaging in human trafficking work, collaboration with your Rape Crisis Center and PCAR is going to be crucial and non-negotiable. So I encourage you to reach out and start creating that collaboration now in any way that you can, and at least talking with them about the resources that they have available. PCCD has published a victim service resource guide, and it should be available through the link that I provide here. It's sort of hard to find otherwise, but if you do enough clicking around on their website, you will get there eventually, I promise. But they have compiled a list of resources, just general resources on who is providing human trafficking services throughout the state. I will put an asterisk on that and just make sure that everyone knows that, those resources, it's up to you to do due diligence and research, particularly in situations where you may be working with transgender individuals, people with drug addiction or substance abuse history, those individuals that have children. There's a lot of stipulations for many of the providers who are, faith-based or not directly connected with either PCAR or PCADV. So just make sure and double check before you're making direct referrals so as not to, traumatize somebody that's already been through a terrible ordeal. If you have any questions, you can always ask me as well. And then finally, I have the Villanova Commercial Sexual Exploitation Institute. Once again, if you have not connected with them, please do. The other resource that I have attached in the files is their one-page Act 105 PDF. I encourage all of you to download that, distribute that if you're doing human trafficking awareness events. It is a really great explanation for advocates to use regarding the state law and how it applies to survivors of trafficking. But they have so many other resources there. And also, they host a survivor symposium every year in April. I believe it'll be the first week of April this year. If you have not attended, I could not recommend that training more. It's amazing. It is survivor-led. The workshops are provided by survivors of human trafficking. And if this is work that you are passionate about or intend to engage in, the Survivor Symposium is a must, because it will provide you with so much information and the ability to network and interact with people who are a part of this work. And I won't gush about it anymore, but it's awesome. So please, 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 if you are able to attend, do so. We have a few more minutes for questions. So I have a question here that says, regardless of who the trafficker is, should we accept survivor into shelter services, even though you're not a dual program DV only? I want to talk about that. I will answer that question offline. This is another one of those nuanced situations, but by and large, if there is a survivor of human trafficking that's asking for help and resources, we want you to feel comfortable and be able to offer them the best services possible. What I will tell you is, if you have a question about that, get in touch with me and we can troubleshoot it together. Most of the time in a trafficking situation, there's going to be a connection in some way to family or partner violence. And in those odd situations where it's not, we want you to at least be able to help refer them to whatever services can help. So you are absolutely able to work with them in that way. But sometimes this may be a case by case, and I don't want to make a general sweeping comment and then get a lot of hate mail. So if you want to talk about this more specifically, I'll ask that you send me an email and we can arrange some time to talk one-on-one, because I want to dig into that a little bit more, but I don't want to talk in generality. So I hope that answered your question. Are there any other questions right now that you would like to address while we're still all together? I hope that I was able to answer a lot of your questions. And I will say, I know that many of you are already taking human trafficking education. I know that a lot of you have taken a lot of different things online or in person. The market is saturated right now. So I really wanted this webinar to be a first step in an ongoing and growing conversation. So many of you participated in my engagement survey last year. I want to continue talking with all of you about what you need from me and from PCADV for help and support as we all learn how to do this work more effectively. So, for example, the questions about, bringing trafficking survivors into shelter and what we are and aren't allowed to do. I want to continue having that conversation so that I have an idea of what you guys are seeing. So if you're having situations where you're not sure if you should be working with a trafficking survivor, I'd love for you to connect with me and talk to me about that situation, because I go by my own experience. I was a trafficking advocate for 3 years and did a lot of my own direct service. So I'm familiar with my own experience, but I really want to know what your experiences are. And so I will put my contact info slide up here so that you all know how to get in touch with me. And I could not encourage you enough to do so, because this is that I am passionate about, and I want to be able to provide great, useful information for all of you. Oh, we have a good request here. Does anyone have any good trafficking scenarios that they're using and would be willing to share? That's awesome. I have some that I've developed for my own trainings, and I would be happy to share them with you through email. If anyone else has scenarios that they're willing to share, maybe you can put your email in the chat box there, and then we can kind of share that so that we can all share that information. That might be the easiest way. Or you can just email me and I can email your stuff out. That's fine too. And that's a good one. And creating those scenarios is really important, because they really do help when we're trying to kind of cultivate something. And I will say, if you are looking for a human trafficking scenario or scenarios for something specific, whether it's advocate training or whether you're doing a healthcare-based training, you can also reach out to me and I would be happy to help you develop your own scenarios too. So even if we don't have one that sort of fits, if you get in touch with me, I would love to help you develop some stuff. So that's an option as well. I'm going to say thank you if there's no other questions, and let you all go on with your day. I really appreciate all of you being here, and I will look forward to providing more training for you guys in the future. So thanks so much and have an awesome day.